We often speak about Moshe Rabbeinu as a leader, as the ultimate Jewish leader, and the lessons that we could learn from Moshe Rabbeinu. But today, the Rebbe is going to take a Rashi about the transition of leadership from Moshe to Yehoshua to teach us something very important about leadership that we learn from Yehoshua. So, where's this Rashi? Shenkeret Filmol, the Rebbe has discussed numerous times, as in Yonosh Rashi Befirush al HaTorah is Rashi's intention and purpose with his commentary, V'Rashi Alein Gitarism Klal, as Rashi himself says, as an overarching principle, Ani loibasi ela lepshito shel mikra. Rashi says, I'm here only to explain the simple understanding of the pasuk. If there's ever a situation where it looks like Rashi is just for the sake of it quoting a midrashic source, when you pay attention to it, you'll see that whatever Rashi quotes that is at the level of Drush, unless he specifies that this is a medrash, Rashi is quoting it not for added value, but because it is absolutely critical to understand the simple meaning of the pasuk. And those is Nikaboy from Bodit and Pirish Rashi, but Parasha Seinu. You're going to see that clearly in a Rashi on our parasha. Rashi sagt der Pirish, was wenn mir is mein in the Pirish, in the Mekaris von dem Pirish, Zeben as das eine drei besondere Droshes Chazal. It's fascinating what Rashi does here. Rashi makes a commentary that when you pay attention to it and you research the background, you see it's an amalgamation of three different commentaries. Ein Gemara, one is a Gemara, and the zweite in Sifri Parasha Vayelach, the second is from the Sifri, but not in our Parasha Vayelach, and then Ulbasoi Vadash Vashteit in Sifri Al Asar, and then he quotes from the Sifri on our Parasha. If you go back to the origin of these three sources, they're not linked, which is interesting. And yet, despite the fact that they're completely unrelated to each other, Rashi rolls them all together into a single explanation on our parasha. So that must be because all three of these elements have to be relevant in order to understand the simple meaning of the pasuk. Because it's the meaning of the pasuk that's going to link these three pirushim. And the order in which Rashi quotes these three commentaries is also relevant to the pshat. Okay, let's find out what these three commentaries are. The pasuk says, Moshe came in front of the Eden and he said these words that they told him to say. He, together with Hoshea, not Yehoshua, Hoshea bin Nun. So Rashi quotes those words. He, Moshe, and Hoshea bin Nun. On his Mefarish explains this. Number one, Shabbos shel diyuzgi hoisa. It was a companion Shabbos. The permission to lead was taken from Moshe and given to Yehoshua. Number two, then Moshe appointed a spokesperson on Yehoshua's behalf while he was alive specifically, that nobody should afterwards complain, Yehoshua, you had no right to take an authority position while Moshe Rabbeinu was still alive. Number three, why here do we call him Yehoshua and not Yehoshua? To tell us that he did not become full of himself, that even though he was given a position of greatness, he lowered himself with humility as he had always done. So let's piece together where the three elements of this Rashi come from. That idea that it was a companion Shabbos where permission was taken from Moshe and given to Yehoshua, that's the Gemara Saita, as we recognize, right? The next part, that Moshe Rabbeinu appointed a spokesperson for Yehoshua, that's Sifri, last week's parasha. On the Teichen von Tzim Pirush state in Sifri Parasha Seinu ala pasuk, and then the concept of why it's called the Hoshea and not Yehoshua, that is from the Sifri in our parasha, in fact on our pasuk. So, why does Rashi link together three unrelated commentaries into a single commentary on this pasuk? Furthermore, so I could maybe explain why the first two belong here. That it was a companion Shabbos, and that Moshe Rabbeinu appoints a spokesperson for Yehoshua. You could see the connection between them. Right? It's a day that they're sharing the roles and then handing over. Makes sense. Oich in zweiten Indian is Mudgash Vidinam Harashus is Aribet to Yehoshua, because both of them convey how the authority is being transferred from Moshe to Yehoshua, so you can see how they blend. But the question why it's called Hosea, not Yehoshua, that's a completely different issue that we're addressing. Which seems to have nothing to do with the transfer of leadership. So not only does Rashi surprise us by linking that under the same heading where he's talking about the transfer of leadership, but he says as if it's a direct continuation and it's adding information to what we've already learned. It's as if Rashi is illustrating that the question why he's called Yehoshua is only a relevant question after you've had the conversation about the transfer of leadership and the Shabbos Shel Yuzgi and the fact that there's a spokesperson. Shabbos Shel Yuzgi. Very strange. So how does Rashi get that not only to be linked, but to sound like a continuation? Now, this question, the fact that Rashi rolls three different sources into a single commentary is not gresa. It's an even greater question than we originally imagined. Why? Because not only are these three different sources, a Gemara and two different places in Sifri. Now Rashi allein bringt die erste zwei Mamorim b'mokim acher, but Rashi has already quoted the first two concepts elsewhere in Torah. And when he did, he quoted each one completely alone. So Rashi himself sees them as independent commentaries. Why now is he making them a single commentary? Where do we find this? In Parshas Pinchas, if in Parshas Pinchas, where the Pasuk tells us that the Eibush tells Moshe Rabbeinu, "V'samachtes yodcha olav," that you should place your hands on Yehoshua to appoint him as the next leader. Zogt Rashi. Rashi says, what are you supposed to be doing, Moshe? Ten lo meturgamon. Give him a spokesperson, that he should be able to teach the Jewish people while you, Moshe, are still alive. Why is that necessary? That nobody could complain. You had no right to take an official position while Moshe is still alive. Same pirush that Rashi is saying over here, except there he says it as a single insight into what's going on in the parasha. Likewise, at the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, even Pasuk, where the Pasuk when Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Lo yuchal lotzis v'lavai," I can no longer lead the people. Zokt Rashi, ein irashai. Rashi says, what does it mean I can no longer the people? I'm no longer permitted to lead the people. Why not? Because the role has been taken from me and given to Yehoshua. In other words, Rashi says that as a standalone commentary on that Pasuk. In other words, Rashi, even according to Rashi, these two ideas, the one of that authority was transferred to Yehoshua, and therefore Moshe gave Yehoshua a spokesperson, are not interdependent, because in Pinchas Rashi says the one, and Vayelech it says the other. So, Rashi verbinden sie zusammen in unser Pasuk. What is compelling Rashi in our Pasuk now to put two things which are unrelated, in fact, three things which are unrelated together? Now the question, we also have to understand that Maimer Shabbos Shel Yuzgi Hoysa Nitel Rishus Misem Nitel Lezeh steht in Gemara ben again under Friedrich Pasuk. As we noted, this idea of it being a companion Shabbos, where the transfer of leadership goes from Moshe to Yehoshua, is mentioned in the Gemara. But the Gemara relates it not to our Pasuk in our Parasha, but to a Pasuk in Parashat Vayelech. In Parashat Vayelech, where it says Vayelech Moshe vi Yehoshua vayisatzu b'Ohel Moed, that Moshe and Yehoshua went and stood in Oil Moed. That's what the Gemara says. Why are they both standing in Oil Moed? Shabbos Shel Yuzgi, because it's a Shabbos where they're sharing the podium. Rashi geht auf sagen dem ganzen Pirush, if dem Pasuk in Parashas Vayelech, wo steht, so surely Rashi should have done the same thing. Rashi should have brought this whole discussion about them sharing the podium and transferring leadership, etc., should have also brought it in that same Pasuk that the Gemara does, because that's the first time we're presented with Moshe and Yehoshua standing side by side in a public forum or in a holy forum. Why does Rashi wait until now? So can man nicht verändern, you can't say, well, the reason is, as we already mentioned, at the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, Rashi already identified the concept of transfer of leadership. So therefore, Davshan Rashaniti Bechazin Dominion Rachamal and Hemshach HaParsha from Pasuk Vayelech Moshe Yehoshua. So if in that Parsha Vayelech he already spoke about the transfer of leadership, he doesn't have to repeat it again at a later Pasuk in the same Parsha. Well, if that's your logic, Valoi Bazoi, then why is he saying it in our Parsha? It's just one Parsha away. We wouldn't have forgotten that in the previous Parsha he said there's a transfer of leadership. On Achmed. And how come now, not the first time we have Moshe and Yehoshua together, a subsequent equation, now Rashi says it's a Shabbos of them working together as a pair. Why now? And likewise, similar question about the fact that Moshe is saying here, that Rashi is saying here, that Moshe gave Yehoshua a spokesperson, even though he said it already in Parshas Pinchas. The fact is, Rashi already told us this information in Parshas Pinchas. That the Eibishter was telling Moshe, give Yehoshua a spokesperson. We have to assume that if the Eibishter told Moshe to do it, he did it. So why is Rashi repeating it in our Parsha? And even you're going to say, yeah, because that was a long time ago. That was in Parshas Pinchas. Yes, very often you see that what Rashi does is, that if it's a whole book away from where Rashi first addressed something, he'll summarize it quickly for us again now. Especially because we're not in our Parsha reading the exact same information we had in Parshas Pinchas. In Parshas Pinchas, Parshas Pinchas is talking about the Eibishter's instruction. Whereas our Parsha is talking about where it actually happened, where Moshe actually appointed the spokesperson. Okay, so maybe that's why Rashi has to repeat himself. Even so. Zamanit move on, it doesn't make sense. Why does Rashi have to explain everything we've already learned before in detail? Including the reason, which he's already told us before, that the Jews might have thought Yehoshua took a role prematurely. He already explained in Parshas Pinchas. As we've discussed numerous times, if Rashi does repeat a commentary he's already given us, he'll usually just do it in short, as a summary. Any time that Rashi repeats information he's already taught us with a tremendous amount of detail, that's only because there's something about the psukim we are now reading that require all of that information again, which obviously raises the question for us, what about the psukim we're reading requires that information that we've already seen in Parshas Pinchas? And lastly, you have to understand something very, very unusual, that Rashi is explaining something more in his commentary on Gemara, apparently, than what he's doing over here in his commentary on Chumash, which seems counterintuitive. That concept of a dual Shabbos, Rashi explains what it means in Gemara as follows. It's a time of two pairs. Later on we'll discuss why it's two pairs. That there were two friends, Moshe and Yehoshua. The first part of the day was Moshe's platform. The second part of the day was Yehoshua's platform. In other words, it would seem that what Rashi is doing over there is that as that you shouldn't mistakenly think that the Yuzgi means a pair, literally a pair, because a pair sounds like they're both together. Because they were not both together. Moshe was still the leader of the Jewish people in the morning, and Yehoshua became the leader of the Jewish people later in the day. They were not a leadership pair. It was a dual-phase leadership. Es ist nicht gewesen von Zug as beide zusammen. It was at no point the two of them standing on the platform together. So in the Gemara, Rashi is explaining the Yuzgi means that they were two great friends who were passing on the torch of leadership. So isn't it moving? It doesn't make sense. But as Rashi is in Gemara, Davtos Barvon and Taben Chamesha say the Gemara. If in his commentary on the Gemara, Rashi has to teach a 15-year-old who's already ready to learn Gemara what the Yuzgi means, Is pshita as a dafeston in limit apia pshat to ben chomish lemikra? Surely he has to explain what the Yuzgi means for the 5-year-old who's learning the simple understanding of Chumash. So we have many, many questions about what's going on in this commentary. So our first major clue is going to be to identify how Rashi uses language that is different to the language used in his primary source, which is the Sifri in Vayelech and the Sifri on our pasuk. So let's look at the comparison. Aleph. In Sifri state, the Sifri tells us that Hashem tells Moshe, you give Yehoshua a spokesperson, and that way Yehoshua will be able to delve and be able to give rulings while you are alive. And therefore, when you pass away, so that way the people will not complain, when Moshe was around, you didn't speak. And now you're speaking, now you're a big deal. Rashi says something completely different. Rashi. Yes, he agrees that Yehoshua has to teach while Moshe is alive. But then he says, it doesn't say that no, people shouldn't say you never spoke in front of Moshe. People shouldn't say you had no right to raise your head in the time of Moshe. What's the What's Rashi emphasizing by saying nobody should have a taina that Yehoshua lifted his head? What does that mean, lifted his head? Secondly, Beis, with regards to the big question why it's called Hoshea, not Yehoshua, state in Sifri, the Sifri says, it's to tell you what a tzaddik Yehoshua was. You'd think that he became full of himself when he was given a position of leadership. Therefore the Torah said, Moshe is standing now next door to Hoshea. He's still the same righteous Hoshea that he was all along, even now that he's become the person who's responsible for the community. Rashi sagt aber in ganz anders. Rashi says something completely differently. That he didn't become full of himself. That even though he was given greatness, listen to what Rashi says, he lowered himself, he humbled himself like he was originally. That's not the same as saying he retained his tzidkus from before. He humbled himself. So these are two key things we have to understand about Rashi. Rashi is talking about laharim roish and hishbilatzmai. Why is that so important? And so that's going to lead us into the explanation of what's happening here. The Tambas Rashi sagt nicht dem Inyan von Shabbos und Yus gehäuse gleich in Onoi Parashas Vayelech. Let's go back to our original question. Earlier in Parashas Vayelech, we said that you have two people. We said that you have Moshe and Yehoshua are ba'ohel moed. And there Rashi does not, unlike the Gemara, Rashi there does not say Shabbos und Yus. See, they're standing together. Doesn't say that. Why doesn't he do that? Is weil dort ist nicht doch ein Hecher zu sagen, als demot hat sich schon angegeben mit Befehl Nesiusa shel Yehoshua, because the context of Parashas Vayelech at the beginning, despite the fact that Moshe and Yehoshua are standing side by side, does not automatically imply that Yehoshua is in a leadership position. Even though that's the same part of Torah where Rashi quotes from the words that Moshe Rabbeinu says, I no longer have authority, is doch Rashi gleich behemshech pirushoi, but Rashi immediately continues as follows: Vashem Omar Elai, that David told me. Rashi says that means lefi Hashem Omar Elai lo savis hayad nazeh, because David told me I'm not going to cross the Yarden. Das heißt, in other words, as in Sinas HaRashus to Yehoshua is neger nit boi bayoim. Rashi is making it clear that the leadership of Yehoshua is not relevant on that day when that conversation is happening. Not Tzidib Dominion of Amela, the Zman from Tavas Hayadin Hazeh. Yehoshua is only really going to step up as a leader when they cross the Yarden. Over Mela is in Token Hecher, as based Amiras Moshe Luchad Oid Lotzes Velavai. There is no proof that when Moshe says, I can no longer lead the people, there's no clear evidence that Yehoshua is now the leader. Moshe, Taka, you don't have the leadership any longer. But it doesn't mean automatically that Yehoshua is the leader. In fact, to the contrary, it implies Yehoshua is still going to be the leader when they get to the Yarden. That's why Rashi doesn't bring Shabbos Shul Diyuzki at that point. Likewise, the pasuk tells us later on in the parsha, where it tells us that Moshe and Yehoshua went to stand together in Oil Moed. Is in them as Yehoshua is around Moshe and Oil Moed. The fact that Yehoshua entered Oil Moed with Moshe is not automatically a sign that he's the leader. Nitoken Teichen as Yehoshua is showing given a Nasi al Yisrael b'foyel. That doesn't mean that he's already now the practical leader of the Jewish people. Das not given Akiyum Ha'amira from the Meibishter. Why they're going to Oil Moed? Because the Eibishter told them to. Kara is Yehoshua. The Eibishter tells Moshe Ben, call Yehoshua, vehisyatzu b'oimoid, and you'll both stand in oimoid, va'atzavenu, and I'll instruct him what he has to do. Doesn't mean he's doing it immediately. I'm instructing him perhaps what he's going to do in a few days' time, when it's time to go to the Yarden. But when we get to our parsha, the pasuk zok, where the pasuk says, vayedaber goimer hu vayisha binun, that he spoke with Yehoshua. Now we have a question. Why is the pasuk suddenly linking Yehoshua to the story together with Moshe? Why is Yehoshua part of this picture? Moshe is the one who's speaking. And yes, of course we know that Moshe has Yehoshua at his side always, and Yehoshua never leaves the oil. Is always with Moshe. My time was the Torah sagt this beferish daf. So why does the Torah have to spell it out over here if it's something that happened for the last 40 years? Musman zog, and therefore Rashi is identifying that you have to in pshat, you have to understand this pasuk as the verto hu vayisha bin nun, that these words that say he, Moshe, and Yehoshua, but since it's not just that they're together, because we know they're together, it's that they're speaking together. Das ist nachdem mit der Torah erzählt, dass Moshe hat gesagt die Shira. Now that the Torah is telling us that Moshe said these words, Shiras Haazinu. It's the pasuk Moshe hu vayisha bin nun. Now the pasuk saying it wasn't just Moshe. It's Moshe and Yehoshua together. The Shira hat gesagt, nicht bloß Moshe allein, nor euch Yehoshua bin nun hat es gesagt, beoznei ha'am. Not only did Moshe say Shiras Haazinu, so did Yehoshua. Together, they transmitted this information to the people. So from dem, was the Torah sagt, hu vayisha bin nun. So the fact that the Torah is telling us that the Shira is now being shared by Moshe and Yehoshua, the lechaera is the word hu, iberik, where the truth of the matter is, the could have just said, vaydaber v'Yehoshua. Why does it say vaydaber hu? That he, emphasizing Moshe, and then Yehoshua, is move on as the Torah is the mitmadgish as Moshe Yehoshua seine da gewähren beide gleich. It must be, and that's how the pasuk reads according to Pshat, that the Torah is telling us in this scenario Moshe and Yehoshua are equals. On the minion of Oif and Dibur Sebesigen from our Nasi Livnei Yisrael, which means they are both now speaking in the role of a Nasi to the Yidden. That's what alerts Rashi to say, on the Rebbe sagt as Shabbos should be used. Now he's telling us this is the Shabbos of a shared podium, this is the Shabbos of two leaders. On Rashi Rashi doesn't have to explain exactly what the Yuzgi means. The intention of the Yuzgi is face value, simple. As he's signing event that they were both leaders. That's it. Doesn't have to get into the detail. Who was the leader first? Who was the leader second? It's irrelevant. The point is, the Torah is telling us they both spoke as leaders. But Rashi identifies that. On the mit, macht Rashi klar. That's why Rashi immediately clarifies. As those who says mamshech lachrez and nitlo reshus mizev nitne lezeh. The fact that Rashi now continues to say that authority and leadership was taken from Moshe and given to Yehoshua. That doesn't mean that Moshe is no longer a leader. It means that Moshe is now not the sole leader. There's a pair of leaders. Because Moshe is not the sole leader of the Jewish people, and he doesn't fit into the classical way that things work, which is that there's a single spokesperson or leader for the Jewish people at any given time. Therefore we say, well, authority is now being transferred. Not fully transferred, but it's already been transferred. It's not exclusively Moshe's. So now we're starting to see how the various parts from different sources all come together in a single explanation, because that's what Rashi is explaining to us. Look at the pasuk, you can see that they're sharing the platform. And therefore I have to tell you that Moshe gives Yehoshua a spokesperson. Why? Und es nicht, and here, unlike his earlier commentary on Parshas Vayelech, he's not happy, Rashi, just to simply say that the permission has been transferred to Yehoshua. Weil in dem besteht der Chiddush von dem Pasuk Hu Vayisher bin Nun, as Yehoshua befehl gerät mit ihnen in demselben Ofen wie Moshe and Asius befehl, because Rashi is identifying that the whole chap of this Pasuk, the whole Chiddush, the whole insight of what's happening historically at this point, is that Moshe is speaking and Yehoshua is speaking alongside him. And therefore, if you want to say that Yehoshua is speaking to the Jewish people, teaching the Jewish people as a leader, then he has to have a spokesperson, because that's how a Nasi speaks. And that also helps us to understand what Rashi is illustrating here, that is beyond what he already told us in Parshas Pinchas. Where in Parshas Pinchas, he said the whole point is, have a spokesperson who could already allow you to address the people while you're alive, Moshe. The fact that in Parshas Pinchas, Yehoshua was given a spokesperson was not yet an indicator that he is a Nasi. Nor, the only reason he has the spokesperson is to give him authority that after Moshe passes away, nobody should have tinus to him. Who are you? And the Pharaoh is given the onzog, therefore the Eibusha told Moshe, make sure that Yehoshua has a Beturgamon who could be his spokesperson while you're alive. Our parasha is illustrating something different. Rashi doesn't simply say that you need a spokesperson, Yehoshua, so nobody doubts your leadership. Rather, he says, first you need to know, the first thing you have to know is that there's a whole change to the leadership structure, and on that day it's Moshe and Yehoshua as the dual leaders of the Jewish people. That means, in other words, the minute you say it's dual leadership, you're not just saying it's giving a stamp of approval to Yehoshua, so nobody should complain afterwards. This is saying you are upgrading Yehoshua, that he is now a Nasi. Not just that in the future when he's a Nasi, nobody should have tinus retrospectively. He is now a Nasi. Yehoshua is a benzug for Moshe Rabbeinu, to the extent that they're considered a pair, that Yehoshua is considered a peer to Moshe Rabbeinu. But Rashi can't leave it at that. Just to say that this is a unique Shabbos, where they are both leaders, and they're both addressing the Jewish people, and the transfer of leadership has started. It's not good enough. Why? That's going to raise a very serious question, which is, why? We don't find this with anybody else. Why, Dafka, now do we have to have a scenario where Yehoshua becomes the Nasi while Moshe is still the Nasi? Completely against the normal principle of leadership, which is there's a single leader per generation. Yes, of course, Moshe had to identify and appoint Yehoshua as his successor. But why have such an unusual and unconventional system where Yehoshua, the student of Moshe, has to take a role of leadership in the lifetime of his Rebbe, the leader? And specifically that they should be like peers. And why is it not like any other leaders that preceded them? As in Asis from Malamokim, I feel when it's the Tzubashtim Givorin in Farois, that the leadership of the successor, even when he was clearly identified by his predecessor, started after he passed, the previous predecessor passed away. Why here? Why here is Yehoshua given Asias in the lifespan, in front of Moshe's eyes? If them is Rashi Mamshich, so therefore Rashi explains, that's why Rashi says it's not an issue of you had to tell us that you're not allowed to speak in front of Moshe. No, the issue over here is we don't want anybody to say Yehoshua, you should never have raised your head in other words, with leadership and authority, while your teacher was still alive. The implication over here is Yehoshua needed to be lifted. Why did he need to be lifted? Because for 40 years, throughout Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime, Yehoshua was the exact opposite of Haramas Rosh. What was his nature? He was the exact opposite of an elevated, dignified person. His entire being was humility to the extreme. He defined himself to his essence as Moshe's attendant. The Torah even refers to him as a youth, and he was not a young man, because he had that humility. His entire being was complete bittul to his Rebbe, to Moshe Rabbeinu, like a youth and like a mesharis, like a servant. And that's nit wie man gefindt ledugma by Aaron. That's very different, for example, to how Aaron conducted himself. In spite of the fact that Moshe was the ultimate Nasi, Aaron taught all the Yidden Torah. Rashi brings in them saying the Mishnah. So Rashi explains the whole hierarchy of how Torah was taught to the Jewish people. Aaron was a key teacher of Torah. Aber bei Yehoshua gefindt man nicht bis damals keinen Sharem Kol Yisrael. Up until this point in time, we find no real leadership of Yehoshua over the Jewish people. Okay, you might say that he led the Jewish people to war against Amalek. That is a particular role of war. It's not leadership over the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu tells them there's a war. You have to go tzei lachem b'Amalek, especially because you are from Shevet Yosef, and only Shevet Yosef can vanquish Amalek, who comes from Edom. But that said, it's not a leadership position. It's certainly not a long-term leadership position. Und der Pfarr hat man da beim Juche gedacht, bewohnen, also soll nicht sagen, because Yehoshua is somebody who was so bittul and so humble. That's why specifically in Yehoshua's case, we have to ensure that we don't have a situation where he is, so to speak, raising his head. Because Yehoshua's entire lifetime, while Moshe was around, was no raising the head at all. Is it a fanik masugo to zayin a nasi b'Yisrael? So you look at him and say, you can't be a nasi. You're a quiet person. You're a person who humbles yourself. And therefore Moshe has to create the environment. He's got to give him the spokesperson so that Yehoshua can raise his head and do something nobody's ever seen before and step into the role of a nasi, while up until this point in time he was effectively a quiet person on the sidelines. And that explains why, once we have this information, and once we know that this is the point where Yehoshua becomes the Nasi, and he has to speak side by side with Moshe Rabbeinu, and it's against his nature, and therefore he has to be Meirim Roish, which doesn't happen just like that. So Moshe has to make it happen for him by giving him a spokesperson. Now you can understand why the Torah calls Moshe. Because and now with that information, now you can understand why the Torah called him Moshe, to tell you he didn't become full of himself. Rashi says daik zu sagen, hishpil atzmei kashe b'tchilosei. And Rashi points out that he humbled himself as he had always been. Not like the Sifri that left it a little bit more generic to say that this is Yehoshua, who is the righteous Hoshea of all times. The question is not simply why is this his name used in this pasuk. Because his name's already been changed to Yehoshua. That's not the question. The question is, why now? Why in this pasuk about the transfer of leadership, about the emergence of Yehoshua as the new Nasi? Why now are you saying Hoshea? Is matam izolim ruf and Yehoshua. The truth is, in this pasuk, which you're speaking about his greatness as the future leader of the Jewish people, you should be using his greater name, Yehoshua. Seeing as the thrust of this pasuk is to emphasize Yehoshua raising himself up with authority, even while Moshe is alive. Why is this the place to refer to him as Hoshea? That's the name he had before he was given a role by Moshe Rabbeinu, and before Moshe Rabbeinu changed his name. Was der Mond, als Yehoshua geht davon kommen zu den Tfilim, Yechedus und von Moshe, as we osid kol yeshachim atzas miraglim. And of course we know why he got that name, because he needed a bracha, and he needed a tefillah, and he needed the tefillah from Moshe himself in order to survive and not be sucked into the nonsense of the miraglim. Rashi says, yeah, well, that's exactly why Hosea is the name used in this pasuk to teach us. Because it's going to teach us what makes Yehoshua such an incredible person. To see what a unique person Yehoshua is, that he doesn't let the leadership raise his stature in his own eyes, but to the contrary, he humbles himself, because Teva Adam is the nature of people. As Bashar says, when a person does have a promotion, and the person has to now adapt themselves to the new reality of who they are and how they have to conduct themselves. The office requires that I should have prestige for the office. And this is not just any ordinary office, this is Nesias. When a person becomes the Nasi of the Jewish people, that raises that person up. He has to step into the role. He can't be a schlepper, can't be looking at his feet while he's walking. We're not chas v'shalom identifying over here that the person becomes arrogant. But there is an appropriate dignity, an appropriate stature that is required by the Torah itself. In order to be a Nasi, you can't be a Nasi if people don't see you as somebody great, and so you have to step into that role. As Rashi says, the part of the instruction to Yehoshua is you've got to have a staff and you've got to be willing to use it. On those that sell the Torah, therefore the Torah points out, as need cooking to give them was mir hat gegeben Yehoshua gedula, despite the fact that Yehoshua was now given authentic greatness which is granted by the Eibishter Torah, it's real greatness. Und hat sich bekommen bis Michas Moshe bei ein Yoffe, the nötige gedula bis Nasus was an Nasi darf haben. And remember that when Moshe gave him smicha, which effectively imparted to him all of the spiritual resources that he needed as a Nasi, there's no question Moshe did that generously. And so Yehoshua is now empowered in the most incredible way. Despite all of that, Yehoshua regains his original humility. In exactly the same way as before Yehoshua became a superstar. His whole life was about serving Moshe and being a humble person. So too afterwards, when he was now given greatness, is bei ihm geblieben dieselbe Hanhoge utno von Shifles Atzmai Hishpil Atzmai Kashem mit Chilosei. He retained the same absolute humility. Wie Schleimer, Shaykh Gamle Rashi hat gebracht früher, and this relates to something Rashi quoted earlier, which was Pnei Moshe Kechama Pnei Yehoshua Kilevana, that Moshe's face is like the sun and Yehoshua's face is like the moon. As bei sich ständig angehört, als am Kabel wie Levana von der Shemesh, which means that Yehoshua had a consistent consciousness that he is just a recipient, as the moon is the recipient of the sun's light. Of a made of bekatnus, veshiflus, vehesim lozeh, and therefore he is in extreme humility. And from them, coming back to what we mentioned at the beginning of the Sikha, this has a tremendous lesson for each of us. Geschehen, wie es ist gewesen bei Yehoshua. As achrei, hat sich gewöhnt zu Gedula. Und nicht zu Gedula Stam, not zu Gedula Nailis Kozoi, as hat gehabt Nasias Shem B'chai Moshe. Look at Yehoshua. He gets greatness. Not just any greatness, he's a Nasi. Not just any type of a Nasi, he's a Nasi during Moshe's lifetime. Und noch ein Öfen von Diuski. And he's a Diuski. He's a partner now. He's a peer now with Moshe. It didn't bother him. It didn't go to his head. It didn't become a definition of how he behaved. He was as humble as before. So every one of us has to learn from this. Yehoshua, especially because we know that Moshe conveyed the whole Torah to Yehoshua and Yehoshua conveyed it to us. Any time that a person is given an opportunity of greatness or leadership, gadlus in an initial sirara, authority, or greatness in another field of life, Whenever a person gets greatness and leadership and authority, they get a tremendous amount of bracha and resource from Hashem. A person could say, listen, the way it makes sense to me, as der von Guf of us, the fact that Eibusha chose me, that I should have this incredible greatness, is as simin, as dafka, Israel, as it means I'm obviously the best person for the job. The Eibusha doesn't make any mistakes. It can make the person feel very bigger, broad, open-minded, comfortable. Obviously, we're not talking over here that a person will become arrogant, because that's not allowed. But a person could feel like, this is good. So Yehoshua teaches us to the contrary. Dafka when we get greatness. That's when we have to be more humble. Und das ist echt die Keli, as regardless of was man geht, soll haben akim, and that ensures the sustainability of greatness, because greatness that goes to a person's head and becomes humble can derail. Greatness that evokes a greater sense of humility lasts. Denyan anal, the Sheikhs in Zman in Yor, wenn man leit die Parasha in Torah, noch over Smichot zu Reish Hashanah. This is particularly relevant at the time we read Parasha Haazinu, which is always shortly after Rosh Hashanah. Because the avoid of Rosh Hashanah is Imru Chulu Shatam Lichuni Aleichem. The avoid of Rosh Hashanah is that we should say Psukei Malchios and we should blow the shofar in order to coronate Eibishter as a king. Eden seine Mamlechet dem Eibishter als Melech. Think about that for a second. We, the Jewish people, we create this role that Eibishter is the king. Melech Yisrael Melech Al Kol Olam Koloi, the king of the Eden and the king of the entire world. Bald, as in from Israel, seeing as this concept of the Eibishter becoming king is something we affect, we achieve. That shows you how important and powerful the Jews are. We're the only people on the planet who have the capacity to make the Eibishter king of all kings. So a person could then walk out of there with a logic that says, hey, I don't have to be a humble person. I'm powerful. I have this opportunity to change the world, to bring the Eibishter as king. So the lesson of Yehoshua is the exact opposite. Especially now that the Jewish people have made such an incredible impact. We have installed, so to speak, the Eibishter as king of the world. The only appropriate response is absolute humility. And that's going to increase the brachas that we get from the Eibishter in to be sealed for a good year, a good and sweet year in the most revealed way, and within the reality of our world, in all the key areas of life, children, health, finances, and all of them in the broadest and greatest way possible. Mitzvah Hashem.